Warning: some of the events depicted in this video are graphic in nature. Discretion is advised. This is my dad, Earl Root, and his father's name was Earl Root. During World War II, he married Alice Pleer, and together they ran a mom-and-pop grocery store from 1955 to 1965. It doesn't exist anymore, so here's my poor rendition. This is literally the story of the Roots and family roots. Warning: there will be dates ahead, but don't worry, you're not in 9th grade and this isn't history class. When people think Irish immigration, many are quick to bring up the Great Potato Famine as the main cause, and they have a very good point. The famine occurred from the mid-1840s to the mid-1850s. During this period, it has been estimated that nearly 2 million Irish people, about a quarter of the population, immigrated to the United States. What people don't always conjure up is that immigration from Ireland started in the 1820s, and that the famine helped create a political climate that had repercussions all the way up until 1921, when the Republic of Ireland gained independence from the United Kingdom. What is also often left out is the fact that the potato blight started in North America. In 1850, a 30-year-old Irishman named Patrick Powell crossed the Atlantic Ocean, leaving Ireland, famine, and chaos behind him. It is not clear if Patrick came from County Clare or the adjacent county Galway, but many agree that the ancestral home of the Powells is Omey Island in Galway. Omey is the tidal island, which means it's a peninsula at low tide and an island at high tide. There were at least 7 children in this particular Powell clan. From oldest to youngest, it was Patrick, who arrived in America in 1850, and the rest of the clan who arrived in April of 1851, and included Bridget, Catherine, Margaret, Edward, and Richard Powell. They all arrived on the ship, the Conqueror. At the time, most immigrant ships were large sailboats called clippers. They were also called coffin ships due to tight living quarters and germy conditions. The Conqueror pulled into the most common port, which was New York. Had the ship had too many ill people, they could have been denied entry and sent to Canada, whereas citizens of the British Empire, they would have been accepted, somewhat reluctantly. Other eastern ports were Boston, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. Many Irish Catholics had a very tough time in the New World. They were poor, many were weak or sick, and they often faced prejudice and hatred. Not only did they face bias from American-born citizens, but they also faced opposition from Protestant Irish. Gangs formed, violence occurred, and tempers boiled over. Despite the prejudice, there were also some welcoming arms and limited employment opportunities. In New York, many poor Irish had no way out of the city and had to settle in the slums and take menial or dangerous jobs. In Boston, many Irish women became domestic servants. By 1860, 2/3 of the servants in Boston were Irish. Most Irish men worked in construction, in quarries, or on the docks. Baltimore meant possibly railroad and canal work. The Powells did not stay in New York. They headed 140 miles northwest to Pennsylvania, where family and friendlier faces waited for them. They wound up in Lackawanna Township. If you're looking for it, you can't get there from here. Lackawanna is now a defunct township due to county and municipal changes. The area lied somewhere between the town of Pittston and the Manuka neighborhood of Scranton, Pennsylvania. In the 1870 census, Edward and his brother Patrick were listed as laborers, but they were most likely connected to mining or railroad work. There were many Powells in Manuka, and here is where it gets tricky. Because of the naming patterns, many shared the same name, a nightmare for genealogists. There were many Patrick, Edward, Richard, John, and James Powells. But fortunately, the tracking got easier. Circa 1870-71, Edward and Patrick Powell went to live and farm in Woodland, near Waverly, Minnesota. They joined a small but sturdy group of Irish Catholic settlers. The trip northwest to Minnesota was nearly 1,200 miles. Patrick brought his wife Mary and 6 children. They would have 3 more children after making it to Minnesota. Edward and his wife Anne brought 4 children to Minnesota, and after reaching Minnesota, they had 6 more children. So if you're keeping score, it was 9 children for Patrick, and Edward had 10. Actually, Patrick had 10, but one child died at the age of 4. Patrick died in 1908 and Edward died in 1890. One wonders what drew the Powell brothers to leave cousins, aunts, and uncles to go to Minnesota. It could have been the desire to get out of the mines, to get out and farm the land. Edward had fought in the Civil War 5 years earlier, and perhaps he just wanted to get away as far as he could. Railroads and technology were moving at a rapid pace, and Minnesota was drawing in not only Irish, but also Germans, Norwegians, Swedes, Danes, and Canadians. In 1860, 20% of the state's foreign-born population were Irish. Those Irish who could not bear farming during the harsh winters gravitated to the cities, especially to St. Paul. But the Powell families worked the land and coped with winter with neighbors with names like Boyle, Mooney, Kennedy, Connolly, and Doherty. On October 16, 1890, the Delano News printed, "Edward Powell died at his home in Woodland this morning at 4 a.m. after a lingering illness of over a year. He was 51 years old, leaves a wife and 11 children in good circumstances, and will be buried Friday." 11 children? Oops. Looks like Edward did win that baby contest, with baby Alice born in 1886. Edward's widow wife was Anne Toole. Anne Toole was born in 1840 in Omagh, Galway, Ireland, the daughter of Anne McCarren and Thomas Toole. She had 6 sons and 5 daughters with Edward Powell between 1862 and 1886. She arrived in America between 1850 and 1853. Anne died in 1926. After a son named Patrick was born, Edward and Anne's second child was a daughter. Maggie Powell was born in December 1866. She met a railroad man named Edison Meandering Roots, and on April 18, 1885, they got married. They had 5 children in 22 years, including Earl Root Sr. And that is the Irish side of our family. But wait, the story is not complete. On the morning of October 10, 1888, in Hazleton, Pennsylvania, hundreds of men, women, and children attended a temperance parade. Temperance as in anti-alcohol consumption. After the parade, around 6:30 p.m., parade goers started to load 7 trains to return home. The trains were supposed to be spaced 10 minutes apart, twice what was considered standard practice. At 7:45, the unthinkable happened. A stopped train, unseen, missing, or misread signals and warnings led to a horrible crash that saw Train 7 collide into Train 6, telescoping through the last 3 cars of Train 6. 64 people were killed and scores were wounded. Among the dead were Powell cousins, Patrick Powell, Richard Powell, Rose Flynn Powell, and one Thomas Toole. The resulting blood and absolute carnage led to several inquiries and changes to the railroad industry. One issue was that rail cars were made of wood and train engines were made of metal. Not a very good mix. On a Monday in September of 1897, Edward Powell's 4th-born child, Edward Jr., was working for the Great Northern Railroad as a brakeman. In the town of Litchfield, Minnesota, he had the unpleasant duty of picking up the remains of a railroad worker named H.C. Winfie, who had been mangled and killed by a switch engine. A switch engine is generally a single train engine built to travel short distances and to maneuver other trains, usually limited to the rail yard. Hours later, Edward was in the Boom Island yards of northeast Minneapolis when he suffered the same fate as Winfie, falling under a switch engine and nearly getting severed. 2 years later, not related to any railroad, Michael Powell died of meningitis. In 1904, 5 years after Michael died, John Powell, who sometimes went by Jack, died in another crushing train accident in the same Boone Island train yard as his brother Edward. A year before John died, in 1903, another Powell died in a train accident. James Powell, who was the son of Patrick and Mary, the other half of the Minnesota Powells. James, along with his brother Patrick Jr., were working as linemen for the Northern Pacific 25 miles outside of Seattle when something went terribly wrong. James was electrocuted by 15,000 volts when the wrong wires got crossed. Patrick almost died trying to rescue his brother James, and 2 other linemen were injured. Not everything between the Powells and railroads were bad. Edison Root worked for the Great Northern Railroad line and made his way up from a yard man to chief telegraph operator. From everything I'm told, he was a strong bull of a man. He met and married Maggie Powell, Edward and Ann Powell's daughter, in 1885. They had a son named Earl Root, and these are my meandering Irish roots.
Tweet, 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 tweet.